Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this special webinar with the Honorable John Brumby. We are very privileged to have him here with us tonight. I'm Professor Nasser Spear, and I'm Deputy Dean in the Faculty of Business and Economics at the University of Melbourne. Let me extend a warm welcome to each and every one of you. Let me also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respect to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. We're delighted to be joined tonight by our Vice Chancellor and our Deputy Chancellor. A very warm welcome to you both. Please also join me in extending a special welcome to our Deans and my fellow Deputy Deans, our Business and Economics Board members, our Alumni Council members, and Young Alumni Committee members. Although for many of you, Mr. Brumby needs no introduction, let me provide a brief introduction. Mr. Brumby was the former Premier of Victoria between 2007 and 2010 and has immense experience in public life, serving for more than 10 years as Treasurer and then Premier of Victoria, 6 years as Leader of the Victoria Opposition, and 7 years as Federal Member of the Parliament for Bendigo during the period of the Hawke government. Since retiring from politics, Mr. Brumby has accepted a number of appointments in both business and not-for-profit sector, including Chair of Motor Trade Association of Australia Superannuation Fund, Chair of Citywide Service Solution, Chair of BioCurate, Chairperson of the Melbourne Convention and Exhibition Trust, Chair of the Fred Hollow Foundation. Mr. Brumby was installed as Chancellor of La Trobe University in March 2019. He's also Honorary Professorial Fellow and Business and Economic Board Member at the Faculty of Business and Economics at the University of Melbourne. In 2017, Mr. Brumby was awarded the Officer of the Order of Australia for his services to medical biotechnology innovation and rural and regional Victoria. And in October 2015, released his book, The Long Haul Lesson from Public Life. Please welcome Mr. John Brumby.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Nasser Spear, and particularly to the Vice Chancellor, Professor Duncan Maskell, to the Deputy Chancellor, to Jane Hanson, and to the Dean, and to all the distinguished guests who are with us today. As you've probably seen, Nasser and I are together on the South Lawn, so we're on what's been a beautiful Melbourne day. I must say this is a bit stressful when you're sitting here and you're watching the participants come in. It's a bit like being on election night and waiting for all of the votes to come in. But thank you very much for the opportunity to speak tonight. I do have some slides which I'll run through, and I'll move to them now if I can. So I've just got a couple of quotes there which go to the nature of the pandemic. But I guess in talking to them, the reason I was keen to deliver this lecture tonight is that in government as Premier, I dealt with a number of crises. We had the Millennium Drought, obviously, which ran right through that decade of 2000 to 2010. We had the global financial crisis. And then, of course, in February 2009, the terrible bushfires in Victoria, which took the lives of 178 people. So from my experience, there's a lot of first-hand experience and learnings from dealing with those crises in government. Since I left politics, which was a decade ago, as Nasser said, I've taken on a number of positions in the for-profit, the not-for-profit, and the university sector. And it's been obviously a period of great challenge and change in those sectors over the last 6 months. And in my role as chair of many of those boards, I think the organisations which I chair turn over more than $1.4 billion per annum and employ around 6,000 to 8,000 people. And so I was hoping to bring some of those learnings to the table tonight. just three things right at the outset before we get into the slides. I think the things that I learned from government, firstly, when you're dealing with a crisis, if something goes wrong, it's normally in the implementation phase. In Australia, generally, our governments at federal and state level during crises work well together. Generally, the policy settings are well informed by evidence-based policy, but my experience is that if things go wrong, it'll be in the implementation phase, and I'll come to that a little later in the lecture. The second is that when you're recovering from an economic recession, things take a lot longer to get done than you think. And this is particularly important when governments are looking for economic stimulus. Many of the big physical infrastructure projects, by the time they've gone through their approvals, environmental approvals in particular, it can be many years before you get the stimulus effect. And the third thing that I learned, particularly through the bushfires, was that for many people, these events can be not just life-changing, but quite traumatic. And so for many individuals, indeed for many communities, the scars, if you like, of a major recession or a bushfire or a major disaster or a loss of life in the family can be with individuals for many, many years. So there's just some preliminary observations. I thought I'd start with this slide tonight because I think it shows great prescience, really, by Professor Ian Golden back in 2014, and you will have had a chance to read that, but also, of course, Bill Gates in his TED Talks. And Bill Gates actually went further than just that quote, and he said, NATO plays war games to check that people are well trained and prepared. Now we need germ games. And he also called for a reserve medical corps, similar to the reserve armies that civilians can join. So tonight, I want to run through these four areas. I will, as Nessa said, leave time for questions and discussions. On the what we know, that the health impact, I know we're bombarded with material, really, whether you're watching the ABC News at night or you're on John Hopkins or you're on the Worldometer, there's a huge amount of information. But it is just worth looking at this map, which shows the concentration of COVID-19 across the world. And you'll see down Australia, obviously New Zealand, we're just a very small part of that. We've done extraordinarily well compared with the rest of the world at this point in time. But it is worth just reminding ourselves just how rapidly COVID-19 has spread across the world, now adding 250,000 cases a day, 16.4 million global cases, and that's up from 571,000 just a few months ago. That is a 30-time increase in just that period. We also know more now about the long-term impacts of the virus. It can stay with people for a long period of time. It can affect the heart, the circulatory system, and it can do serious injury to people's lungs in an ongoing sense. We also know that the impact of COVID-19 is, as I've said, it's uneven and it's unequal. And it's a really important point to make. It's not just about the numbers that you saw in the slide before. This virus has a disproportionate impact right across the globe. We see it with the old. We see it particularly amongst poorer people and poorer communities. Congregate settings, so whether it's aged care facilities, whether it's abattoirs, whether it's high-rise, whether it's migrant accommodation, it's congregate settings. And in the US and UK, in particular, it's people of colour. And what's driving that is two things. Firstly, the experts would say, in part, it's comorbidities, but it's principally lack of access, it's inappropriate treatment, and in the United States, of course, it's lack of healthcare insurance. Some figures that I was looking at today, in the US, Black Americans are dying at 3 times the rate of white Americans. In Washington, and many of us will be familiar with Washington, that huge disparity in wealth, it's actually a 6 times ratio of black to white. In Australia today, this is the information that goes up every day on the federal government's health website. Again, you've seen that. I don't need to dwell too long on that, but it is worth recalling that Australia saw its first case on January 25, and we now have close to 16,000 cases. In terms of distribution, those 2 graphs show it pretty clearly. The age distribution, predominantly younger people, middle-aged people, but when you look at death rates, it's predominantly older people. That is not to say exclusively. As you know, in Australia, we've had deaths now of people as young in their 40s. We've had a number in their 50s and 60s, but certainly the incidence is greater amongst younger people. For most part, the carriers, I think we can say the carriers are young, but the worst suffering is amongst older Australians and older people. In terms of the economic impact, this is an OECD graph. It shows that really starkly, particularly in the advanced economies. You'll see for 2020 there, that's calendar year down 8%. Most interesting, and I'll come back to this later, amongst the emerging markets, just a 3% reduction and a quicker rebound next year. Greg Smith, known tax expert, speaking at CEDA recently, said the economic profile of this crisis differs markedly from that of the global financial crisis and most previous crises, which derived mainly from failures in one or more financial markets. Because it's based on a physical disaster and has required the government to limit movement of people and associated production, this crisis involves both a supply disruption and a demand collapse. And I've seen that in my role as chair of the Melbourne Convention and Exhibition Centre. We physically can't hold conventions at the moment, but there's no demand for them at the moment. So our revenue has dropped from 110 million a year, a record, to 0. And we see it too with universities, with international students. There's plenty of demand, but they just can't get here at the moment. So both sides, demand and supply, are affected. According to look, the other thing that we can say that we know is big government is back. This is a slide that I borrowed from McKinsey's, and it just shows how huge the economic stimulus is that's being applied globally. And I must say, as the Premier at the time of the global financial crisis, we thought what we did in Victoria, we thought what the Rudd federal government did, we thought this was unprecedented. But it's nothing compared with the extent of stimulus that's been injected in by governments this time round. And according to McKinsey, this is back in April, governments across the globe have announced stimulus plans amounting to 10.6 trillion US. That's the equivalent of 8 Marshall Plans that were put in place after the Second World War and produced such a boost to economic activity globally. And in Australia, of course, governments have spent so far more than $160 billion Australian on stimulus. I think back to the times I was Treasurer in Victoria, 2000 to 2007. Typically in our Victorian state budget, so we're a quarter of Australia, our new spending initiatives would be around $400 to $500 million a year. So governments now to date at $160 billion and growing. And we know too, this shows it very, very clearly, the extent of the deficit. Again, we think back to the recessions in Australia, the early 80s, the early 90s, the global financial crisis. What we thought at the time were big stimulus packages to get jobs going. Nothing really compares. You've got to go back to the Second World War to the extent of the deficit, the stimulus which is being provided this time around. Ross Gittins, in an article in The Age, pointed out recently that relative to the size of our economy, Australia's net public debt is much smaller than the Eurozone and the United States. And of course, it's almost invisible if you compare it to Japan. And that, of course, brings me to the Governor of the Reserve Bank, Philip Lowe. So this was his speech last week. And you can read the quote there, but he's basically saying we've got to get on top of the health issues. If we don't get on top of the health issues, it's going to be a very bumpy and drawn-out recovery. And he's saying, secondly, it's crucial to keep those support measures going. And he makes the point that in the last 120 years, you've never seen borrowing rates as low as what they are today, where the federal government can borrow for 10 years at under 100 basis points. My own view is that we owe Philip Lowe a great debt of gratitude as Australians. It was really when the Australian economy was so sluggish last year, it was really Governor Philip Lowe who went out, who provided monetary stimulus, who cut interest rates. He didn't always get the support of commentators and analysts in doing that. But I think without that, Australia would have been in a much, much worse position at the start of this crisis than we were. And really, we owe that to him for the way in which he went out and sold that message about monetary policy and matching that with strong fiscal support at a federal level. When we think of the impacts, the social impacts of COVID-19 are many. You know, you could do whole lectures on this, but I did just want to put this up to bring people's attention to this today. This is the early release of super. So I chair MTAA Super. We're a $12 billion fund. We're a top performing fund, a top 5 fund across Australia. But this is analysis done on Queensland, where 27% of all of the early release of super has occurred. And this is analysis done by Industry Super, which shows the number of withdrawals per federal electorate. And for me, these numbers are staggering. You know, in the seat of Brisbane, there's been 50,000, well, effectively to date, 50,000 withdrawals. There's only 110,000 adults who can vote. So it's close enough to 1 in 2 adults have withdrawn that first tranche of super. And when you think about, and so you can look at the other federal electorates. And of course, this has been extended by a further 3 months. When you think of what this means to people's retirement, it means that there's literally going to be millions of Australians who've either lost their superannuation account because they've withdrawn it totally, or who are going to be much, much poorer in retirement than they otherwise would be. And this is just one aspect, I think a staggering aspect of the societal impacts of COVID and government policy. The other thing I think we know to date is that community really matters. And I've just put up a good quote there which really highlights that most citizens do oblige, they do obey authorities. And we've seen that, certainly in my experience in public life, during the Millennium Drought in Victoria, where we nearly ran out of water. We had Target 155. We had enormous cooperation from households who saw that there was a problem, who saw that we had serious water shortages, and all worked together to reduce the consumption of water per day. So overall, community has been pretty compliant. Community has joined in to try and defeat the COVID virus. But having said that, we are seeing fractures emerging. Again, you will have seen these on social media, you will have seen them on the TV at night. A lot of freedom fighters out there, a lot of people who believe that COVID is spread by 5G, a lot of people who believe that COVID is just the first step towards compulsory vaccination, a lot of people who believe it's a conspiracy by governments around the world to take control. So we are seeing some fracturing. Not a great deal in Australia, but we're certainly seeing a lot of fracturing overseas. What we also know is that the second wave, which we hoped to avoid in Australia, globally and in Australia, there's, you can look at the waves come in, and that's exactly how they look when you're in the surf, and they just come in one after another, and we're well and truly on that second wave. And one point that Bill Gates makes, and it's a really, really important point, and he says this: exponential growth is not intuitive. If you say that 2% of the population is infected, and this will double every 8 days, most people won't immediately figure out that in 40 days, the majority of the population will be infected. And it's 2 to the 5th or 2 to the 6th. So you get to 64% of the population, and it happens that quickly. And without government controls in place, like social distancing, like masks, that's exactly what would occur. Some of you may have seen this quote: the hammer and the dance. Thomas is not an epidemiologist, but he is a writer, and this has been viewed by tens of millions of people around the world. It's a very strong metaphor, the hammer and the dance. And the virus comes along, and we hammer it down, and then when we've nearly got rid of it, we take off the controls and we dance again, and then the second wave arrives and we'll have to hammer it down again. And I think we're seeing that pretty much occurring right round the world. One slide I didn't put up, which I probably should have in terms of what we know, is that COVID is already having an implication, implications for democracy and for governments around the world. The Melbourne School of Government, Professor Tom Daly, is worth having a look at this on the website, has done a fantastic paper on this. He's analysed the types of leaders around the world, looking at the US president, the Brazilian president, and contrasting that with others. But he's also advised that there are now 140 countries or states around the world that have delayed elections because of COVID-19. So one thing we do know is that there will be an impact on democracy. So let me come to response and change. I began writing my notes for this lecture 3 weeks ago, and when I was thinking about response and change at government level, when I looked at what was happening nationally at state level, I thought it's a textbook, it's a copybook response. Everything was done well and everything was done right. I modified that in light of recent events to say that it's a textbook early crisis response. And you'll see in my bottom point there, the 5th dash, the truth is we've had some implementation challenges and indeed, to be honest, some failures. But if you look overall at the response at government level, it has been pretty much textbook. We've had at federal and state level clear communication with the public every day, those daily press conferences, which get huge ratings. We've seen the response driven by evidence-based policies. The best epidemiologists, by the way, so many of them based around our best universities, including here at the University of Melbourne, and of course the chief medical officers. We've seen government sharing the challenges with the community, and the Prime Minister is right when he says we are all in this together. We've seen pretty much a complete absence of political slanging. There's been a tiny bit of it, but the reality is that governments have worked exceptionally well together. In terms of governance, we've seen the establishment of the National Cabinet, which I think has performed exceptionally well. We've seen at federal level and state level, we've seen the creation of crisis committees of cabinet. These are typically 6 or 7 of the more senior ministers with the Premier and Treasurer who are able to get decisions made in a timely way so that action can be taken immediately. We've seen the widespread use of emergency powers, far more so than I've ever seen previously in government, so very widespread, and it's interesting to see where that will lead later on. And of course, we've seen less parliamentary scrutiny. I've made the point there about independent scrutiny, the issue with the quarantine hotels, the judicial inquiry, which is short of a royal commission, the highest level of independent inquiry you can get in Australia. We've seen the establishment of the COVID Commission, now given a special place within government, and of course, huge fiscal and monetary stimulus at federal level, JobKeeper, JobSeeker, and at state level, the Work for Victoria program, which with my citywide hat on, where we've taken on something like 3,000 short-term employees, that's been extraordinarily important to give short-term employment to people who've lost their work, who've lost their job, and who haven't been eligible for other forms of support. So that's what I agreed at government level. Pretty much textbook, but we have seen challenges and failures. Obviously, what's occurring in nursing homes, and obviously what occurred with quarantine. And as I said right at the beginning of my lecture tonight, my experience in government is that often if things are going to go wrong or you are going to be challenged, they are normally in the implementation phase. All of that at government level to this point in time has received a big tick from the public. So if you look at the polling on this, and particularly for the Prime Minister, where earlier this year he was struggling, really struggling during the bushfires, but you can see his approval ratings now have been quite stratospheric. And ditto, if you look at the bottom part of that graph for the state premiers, ditto equally, they have been seen to be performing by the public exceptionally well, and again are enjoying extraordinarily high approval ratings. One thing that is occurring internationally is this thing called the trust bump. So as governments are going through that early stage and first stage, and they're getting on top of coronavirus, they're winning the trust of people. They're enjoying very high approval ratings. But what we are seeing around the world is that when that second wave comes and it gets away from governments, they lose that trust, they're seen not to be in control, and their approval ratings start to decline. Across business and the not-for-profits. So the learnings that I've taken from this, so I've just listed down the left-hand side there, the organisations that I chair, with which I'm involved. The things that I've seen here on the governance side, much more frequent board meetings. So typically, as you know, with board meetings, monthly or quarterly, we've been having many more frequent meetings, often fortnightly. Again, the online digital revolution has really enabled that. We've seen the establishment across most organisations of critical incidents committees or crisis committees. At La Trobe, for example, back in March when the first lockdown occurred, those meetings were occurring every morning at 8 a.m, usually running for an hour and a half. I attended those as Chancellor, but essentially the Vice-Chancellor and all of the senior executive group. We saw that too. We did that with Citywide, with Melbourne Convention Exhibition Centre in the early stages. Those crisis committees have in general morphed into what I would call reset and recovery committees. And typically they're a committee of between 6 and 10, comprising members of the board and the senior executive group, looking at how we recover from COVID and how we reset the organisation going forward. And I think the other learning is much more frequent interaction. between chairs and CEOs, where often discussions, obviously at least weekly, but often much more frequently between chairs and CEOs. The online revolution, we all know about that. We're doing that now. Zoom, Teams, WebEx, BlueJeans, Skype, and we've seen this explosion in working from home. Many organisations have taken cuts to salaries and board fees. Probably half of the boards I'm on, we've taken cuts of 10 or 20% in board fees. At La Trobe, the senior executive group has taken salary cuts of 20%. La Trobe University also signed up to the job protection framework with really an extraordinary result where close to 3/4 of all of the staff voted for a salary cut of up to 10% to save jobs. So these are things that you couldn't really imagine, I don't think, a decade or two ago. On top of all of that, I think actually, ironically, communication has improved and town hall meetings, for want of a better expression. I know Melbourne Uni's been doing that, La Trobe's doing that, Melbourne Convention Exhibition Centre, citywide. These have provided an opportunity for CEOs and staff to meet and for great feedback. And the final one I'll put there, pivot and innovation. Every organisation and business is looking at how they can pivot and innovate to the future. I'll just put that up quickly. I won't dwell on it, but this was a workplace survey completed a couple of weeks ago at the Melbourne Convention Exhibition Centre. We employ 1,000 people, about 500 permanents, about 500 casuals. The point of all of this is that people like working from home. Obviously, we're not doing any business at the moment, but we have a large group working on redeveloping the business for the future. But overwhelmingly, the sentiment for our employees from working from home is very positive. Ditto, this is citywide, and so we employ 1,000 people, most of them permanent, about 450 office staff, and the rest all outdoors on waste, on parks and gardens, and so on. This was a survey done of our office staff who've all been working at home since March. And again, the point of putting this up is that it's overwhelmingly positive. It's not to say there are no issues. You'll see there that staff do have difficulty switching off at the end of the day. Sometimes the working days can be long, but overwhelmingly, in terms of safety, productivity, ergonomics, work-life balance, employees are saying that they like working from home. Lessons. This is something from BCG, and it's pretty instructive. And they're really just saying that every major global crisis produces a big wave of change. Think of 9/11, it's not just aviation security, but security became one of the fastest growing industries in the world. Second World War, women getting into the workforce. And so I guess the interesting question is, so what is the big change that's going to be arising from COVID? And I think the big change is going to be working from home. But I'll come to that in a moment. I think the first sort of lesson that I see is that adaptation has been rapid. So there's going to be a lot more adaptation. And as I've said there, I think it's become embedded and it's going to be ongoing. You think of online lectures and meetings, the transformation, and that's what it is. It's not just a transition, it's a transformation that particularly universities have made to shift what was a face-to-face industry into online lectures and meetings has been profound. Cashless transactions, it'd be 3 months since I've used cash in any transaction. It's just all on the card. The working from home, the way we've adapted to sanitisers, to masks, generally to social distancing. And of course, most shops that you go into now have protective barriers, and they've just gone up pretty seamlessly. So I think that adaptation has become pretty well embedded and is going to remain so in the future. I have a view. History will prove whether I'm right or wrong, but I think working from home is a game changer, and it's got huge ripple effects. I think back to the period that I was Treasurer and then Premier in Victoria, where our workforce growth and our population growth put extraordinary strains on our public transport system, with patronage growing 5, 6, 7, 8% per year, and we just couldn't keep up. And if I could have decreed that everybody has to work 1 day a week or 2 days a week from home, I think we would have seen profound changes to the way in which our cities were organised, and profound reductions in time to travel to work and congestion. And I've just put those statistics up there about the number of trips that are taken off the road from just one extra day working from home. And if you combine that again with what technology can do, active transport pricing, this is a matter for governments in the future, but if they wish to, again, to increase the pricing of public transport during certain hours of the day, if they could negotiate with Transurban to change tolling pricing during the day, you can smooth people's movements in and out of the city, again, reducing congestion, but also making working places safer. But I think this is a game changer. It's going to improve housing affordability. It's going to increase livability. Why is that? Because we've had this issue, particularly in Victoria, and particularly in the western and northern suburbs, where people commute to work in the CBD. They're often travelling up to 2 hours a day. If just 30, 40% of those people can work from home, the improvements in their quality of life, the time available they have every day for family or leisure, is again quite profound. We're seeing already an accelerated shift to the regions. Some of the data on real estate is already confirming this. I spoke to 2 real estate agents last week, one in Bendigo, one in the Macedon Ranges. Their May, June and July sales are all up markedly, like 2 or 3-fold on this time last year, and most of their customers are young couples from the city. And of course, all of that is going to produce major challenges for the CBD. Will we ever see the number of people back in the CBD that we saw pre-COVID? I've got a statistic here somewhere. I've lost that. I'll come back to that later if I can find that. It's about the number of, in Melbourne. Before the pandemic, 1 million people a day would be coming into the city. Figures on Monday show that number has dropped by 80%. Public transport patronage is about 10% of where it was. I think this is another lesson. It's another learning. Localism is accelerating. We're seeing already the reshoring of some manufacturing, and that's because international supply lines have been disrupted. That's not a bad thing for Australia. We've lost a huge amount of our manufacturing in recent decades, and some revitalisation. I know the AMWU has put out some data on this, on the potential number of jobs that can be created. But we are seeing localism accelerate. Again, local travel, visitation, the pivot to new products. A lot of those gin distilleries have now become very successful in making both gin and hand sanitisers. And of course, we're seeing a lot more services delivered to the home. I think this is a really important point to make, and it's a crucial one really for Australia. This whole debate about China, this tension that we feel in Australia, how strongly we are being sort of tugged and pulled by the United States. The reality is much of the economic growth that we've enjoyed in Australia in the last 3 decades has been because of the growth of China. China's extraordinary growth has been of enormous benefit to Australia. Indeed, post-GFC, China has probably accounted for 40% of our economic growth here, and it's principally the reason why Australia's living standards, our GDP per head, is amongst the very highest in the world. But this is Nick Bisley at La Trobe, and he makes a really profound point. And that is that as we go through coronavirus and as the world moves through global recession, the US is likely to be weaker and China is likely to be stronger than before. David Crowe made this point in his article in The Age, and it's pretty simple arithmetic. China is forecast to grow by 1.75% this year, 8.25% next year. The pandemic has increased the pace at which China catches up to the developed world, and that's true. And China's share of the global economy has been steadily increasing. It's an arithmetic certainty that while they grow at those rates and the developed world shrinks at the rates we saw predicted by the OECD, China as an economic power will be more important and not less important. And for us in Australia, whether we're talking about exports of minerals or beef or wine or barley or wool, or whether we're talking about research partnerships or whether we're talking about overseas students, this relationship is far more important than any other relationship that we have, and mending it and getting it right is, I would have thought, right up at the very top of the list for Australia if we want a strong recovery from COVID-19. I'll just finish on this, just some thoughts about where we go from here. If you think about it, you know, is it a global crisis, or is it some would say a global catastrophe without being too gloomy? You know, we've got a global health crisis, we've got a recession. For most of the world, we've got a depression. Indeed, you know, for Australia, if a depression is 2 years of negative GDP growth, we are headed for depression. We've got those huge geopolitical tensions. You're seeing them play out in the South China Sea. And this is a quote I borrowed from Jim Brumby. You can read that, but I think it's pretty right at a speech he made at the World Bank very recently. We're going to see government and institutions respond in ways that we've not seen before and in ways that we are just beginning to imagine. And the recovery is certainly not going to be linear. This theme of building back better means a lot of things to a lot of people, and it's going to mean different things. And you can read about this. Different organisations have lists of 10 criteria of that, but I think for me, just some very simple things ought to be guiding us out of this huge recession stroke depression. Things that create net new jobs, quality of life, cleaner environment, and importantly, let's not forget intellectual capital, making sure that we are a smarter and more innovative country in our recovery phase. I've just put this graph up on building back jobs because it's a graph of unemployment in Australia. I was a member of the federal parliament during the Hawke government in the 1980s, and we won government on reconciliation and reconstruction and recovery after the recession of the early 80s. But the point of the story is, despite all of the stimulus, the reconstruction and the recovery, you can see there that it took the best part of a decade for unemployment to get back to the level it was at the start of the recession. And the same story, if you go to the recession of the early 90s, despite the big stimulus package, Paul Keating of One Nation, it took the best part of a decade to get unemployment back to where it was. And of course, if you think of GFC, we've never got back to the unemployment rate which we had before the GFC. And one thing I learned during the 1980s as the federal member for Bendigo, where in many parts, many country towns, many parts of country Victoria, unemployment rates hit 16, 18, 19%, there was a very long tail of unemployment. And once people have been out of work for 6 months or more, it's extraordinarily difficult for them to get back into the labour market. So there's been really no discussion in Australia to date about programs targeted towards the long-term unemployed, but we are definitely categorically going to need them. And they're going to be programs like community employment programs, building bike paths, building walking tracks, revegetation, tree planting, and environmental projects. They have a really vital role to play. Building back cleaner. I'm a big fan of this. Probably doesn't surprise many people, but this again been highlighted by Professor Ross Garnaut, his book on superpower, just how quickly, what a wonderful opportunity this is with interest rates at record low levels. Here is an opportunity to transform the way in which our economy and energy systems and markets work. So I've simply put that slide up there, but tackling climate change, building efficiency retrofits, investing in education and training, you can read that. I think this is a huge opportunity. Consistent with that, the Clean Energy Council, they've done their own analysis on this in terms of tripling the amount of large-scale renewable energy, what that could mean in terms of generating new jobs, but again, many other things on their agenda, including building retrofits. And this is a win-win. It generates jobs. There are no long delays in terms of economic stimulus, and we build a cleaner and better environment. Social housing. I would have thought this is a Monty for a huge investment program. Truth of the matter is that really since the late 1980s, Australian governments at all levels have been cutting funding for public housing, social housing in real terms. We've got a construction industry at the moment, housing construction industry, which is literally on its knees. The beauty of housing is it's a quick start, it's a quick stimulus, it's a quick job generator, and it's got big multipliers. And I would have thought this is an initiative which can generate jobs very quickly, can generate revenue for governments, and can address real equity and social needs in our community. And the last one I want to finish on is this one is about building back smarter. I put a quote there from Professor Deborah Terry, the Chair of Universities Australia. It's been amazing, really. You know, if you think of the whole debate, the discussion, the work of epidemiologists, the scientists, the research into vaccines, the treatments, the repurposing of drugs, none of this could have happened without the skills of our people in our universities. And it's ironic, it's a stronger word than that really, given that universities are facing this huge decline in funds available to support research. And, you know, as those from the sector know, there have been long-term and gradual declines in the contribution of the federal government to research in Australia. What has funded the huge growth that we've seen in the last decade has been international students. And the international student market is an industry which the universities themselves generated and created. For Victoria, it's our largest export earner. For Australia, it ranks fourth amongst all of the things that we export. And this was an industry, great in terms of revenue, great in terms of jobs, but much, much more than that. Building networks, building contacts, building diplomacy, building relationships with countries overseas, doing public good, social good in helping students on scholarships from poorer countries. And above and beyond all of that, providing the funds that have enabled universities to so significantly increase their research. But the point of the story, and I'm finishing on this, is that without a substantial injection of additional funding from the federal government for research, we will lose the extraordinary intellectual capital that we've built up over this decade in our universities. And there's a lot of discussion, there always is, when you have an economic recession or depression, about physical capital, about infrastructure, about generating jobs. But we haven't heard enough discussion or enough focus on intellectual capital. And to me, when we think about recovery, those two things ought to be on an equal footing. Yes, we need to invest a lot in our physical capital and our infrastructure, particularly producing a cleaner and healthier environment, but we can't neglect our intellectual capital. And I think it's something that Prime Minister Boris Johnson has recognised in the UK with his recent announcements of a significant additional boost to research funding for universities there to make sure that the university sector gets through these difficult times without damaging and losing that extraordinary intellectual capital. So I'll finish it there. I can't see the clock. I have no idea how far over time I went, but we've got a few minutes, I think, for questions.
Sorry, thank you, John. We have got about 10 minutes remaining, so we have a number of questions. Probably I will, when I look, we've got a number of them, but they're all looking at the following area. Looking into the future, how do we restructure governments? How do we restructure economy and our tax system? How do we restructure universities? And how do we restructure our industries and our manufacturing and the like? So I will, given the limited time, I will be quick and addressing few sample. Apology to all those who submitted questions. We are not going to be having enough time. So let me start with the question about shaping our government. So the question here is, do you think that the crisis would lead to a push for constitutional change in Australia regarding federalism? And related to that is the question within government, what national cabinet will play versus the Council of Australian Government, kind of that side of it. So if you can touch on that side, and then I'll move to another question.
So thanks, Nasser. I don't think this will produce any constitutional changes. I can't see those. I mean, there's the issue of Indigenous recognition, which is still there, but I think it's a separate issue to COVID. The National Cabinet is a step in the right direction, but as I've pointed out, and the Melbourne School of Government has pointed out, there are changes that will need to be made to the National Cabinet if it's to be enduring in the long term. It's working well at the moment in crisis. Everybody is working together, but it really needs a shared agenda. It needs an independent secretariat. It needs the state and the states and the prime ministers to agree on the agenda going forward. So it's a good first step, but it needs refinement.
Thank you. Question then I'll move regarding the tax system and the economy. You've alluded to the facts about the uncertain recovery and the large deficit facing us and the huge amount of debt. This immediately begs questions about our tax system and what proposal. I know this is a big question, so if you can brief kind of...
Look, I think if you read my book, rightly or wrongly, fairly or unfairly, I've been a long-term proponent of increasing the GST, and I'm a proponent of that because our tax base is extraordinarily narrow. We rely in Australia on income tax even more heavily, actually, than we did before John Howard introduced the GST in 1999. So that burden on income earners falls very, very heavily. So we need to broaden out our tax base. Having said that, and in my book, which was back in 2014, I set out a formula for doing that. Having said that, I can't see the federal government at the moment agreeing to increase the GST. And indeed, many of the state premiers have said that they wouldn't support it. So I don't think that's going anywhere at the moment. I think there's a very strong case that can be made for the cash, what we call essentially a cash flow tax on business. So changing corporate taxation to essentially a cash flow tax arrangement. Again, Ross Garnaut and Craig Emerson have been quite prominent in talking about that, and that was touched on, of course, in the Henry Review. So I think that's one change that could be made. One thing I do support, because I saw this work so well when Paul Keating brought down what was his One Nation stimulus package when he became Prime Minister, and that was investment allowance. I think that the fact is we have a crisis in private sector investment. If you take out mining investment in Australia, it's at catastrophic low levels, and we need to see a resurgence. And there's plenty of money around, but people aren't investing. And I think an investment allowance at 20% or more, I saw the investment that got brought forward. I saw transformation of things like the tourism industry because of that investment allowance. So I would certainly support that. We could talk for days on tax, but I think that's probably enough.
Very good. Australia, as you know, rely heavily on small to medium enterprises as well as regional development or regional access. So you spoke about working from home and what, in your opinion, this could mean for regional Australia. And I guess that's quite a big concern.
Yeah, well, I think I mentioned in my remarks there, and again, it's not particularly scientific, but just getting the feel of whether there's a shift to the regions occurring already, and my view is that there is, and I think that's the anecdotal evidence I referred to from what's happening in real estate. But I just know from people my family know, and people will make the shift. And if you're within 90 minutes, I think, of Melbourne, if you're able to work from home in the future, if you're in the knowledge industry, you can work from home. Even if you have to do a day or two in person at work, that's a very livable set of arrangements. And so I think the digital transformation, which still has got more to run, the working from home, those two things together will lead to a renaissance, if you like, of the attractiveness of regional living.
Thank you. And final question, let's talk about universities. You are at La Trobe and you're also affiliated with Melbourne through the appointment and the board. I guess the question is, in your views, what shifts should happen within the university sector in Australia in particular, especially we're dealing now with a very uncertain competition globally with regard to repositioning of universities?
Yeah, well, I mentioned that, I guess, at the end of my speech. I think there's a lot of things that need to happen. Obviously, the support which has been provided at federal level in guaranteeing CSP funding is welcome. It provides a base and it provides a sense of stability. But I think, as I said before, in the overall discussion and debate at government level, and indeed, in the community and among opinion leaders, there hasn't been enough focus on this issue of the smart economy, the importance of innovation, the importance of research and development, the significance of intellectual capital playing a role in our recovery and the long-term future and success for Australia. So universities are going to need more support to maintain the research effort. It would be a tragedy of, I think, great proportion if universities are forced to lose more of their best people and their best minds. And we know NASA, just from the numbers on international students. I know from La Trobe, where we've taken pay cuts. We've already done one BDP package. There will need to be more in the future, but we need to limit this as much as we can. And so I think looking to the UK is one example, but as Glyn Davis pointed out in an article recently, the Black Plague, I think it was the Black Plague he was talking about, cost 5 universities. It remains to be seen how many will be lost during COVID-19. But I think the key for us is support for research and development in particular, and that is going to require funding at federal government level.
Thank you, John. I think we have reached time. Thank you very much for very informative and very useful lecture, and we hope to talk more to you about how as we come out of COVID-19. Thank you.
Thank you, Ness.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Bye-bye.